Picture the Mediterranean, not just as a body of water, but as a living, breathing crossroads where empires rose and fell, where cultures clashed and blended, where the fate of millions was decided with the stroke of a pen. For centuries, this sea was the stage for some of history's most dramatic moments, and yet one of its most pivotal turning points remains shrouded in obscurity. In the year 1639, a single treaty, quietly signed in the dusty plains of Zuhab, reshaped the destiny of this region forever. How could one forgotten document, buried in the archives of time, alter the fate of empires? The Treaty of Zuhab didn't just end decades of brutal conflict between the Ottoman and Safavid empires. It redrew the map of the Middle East, silenced the drums of war, and set in motion a chain of events that would echo through the centuries, shaping the world we know today. This isn't just a story of borders and battles. It's a tale of high-stakes diplomacy, of rival rulers forced to the negotiating table, of cultural exchange that flourished in the shadow of war. The Treaty of Zuhab didn't merely stop the fighting. It created a new order, one where trade routes reopened, where ideas flowed as freely as goods, and where the delicate balance of power shifted in ways no one could have predicted. But here's the twist. The most fascinating consequences of this agreement weren't written in its clauses. They unfolded silently over generations as the ripple effects of that single moment in 1639 spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. So what really happened at Zuhab? How did this treaty, often overlooked in the grand narrative of history, become the invisible hand that steered the Mediterranean world toward its modern destiny? The answers lie in the untold stories of the diplomats who brokered the deal, the soldiers who laid down their arms, and the ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by its terms. This is a journey into the heart of a forgotten turning point, one that holds the key to understanding how the past shapes our present in ways we rarely stop to consider. By the time we're done, you'll see the Mediterranean and the world it connects in a whole new light. The Mediterranean in the early 17th century was a world on edge, less a unified sea than a fractured chessboard where empires, faiths, and fortunes collided. To sail these waters was to navigate a labyrinth of danger and opportunity, where Ottoman galleys patrolled the coasts, Barbary pirates lurked in hidden coves, and merchant ships from Venice to Alexandria raced to carry silks, spices, and silver between continents. At the heart of this volatility lay the bitter rivalry between two titans, the sunny Ottoman Empire straddling 3 continents and the Shia Safavid dynasty ruling Persia's highlands. Their conflict wasn't just about territory, it was a holy war, a clash of Islamic visions, with cities like Baghdad changing hands in sieges so brutal they left the earth itself scarred. Yet amid the bloodshed, the Mediterranean thrived as a paradox. Even as armies clashed, trade never truly stopped. Venetian glass found its way to Isfahan's bazaars. Persian carpets adorned palaces in Istanbul. The very ports that launched warships also welcomed merchants speaking a dozen tongues, their cargo holds filled with goods that made kings and sultans rich. Europe watched this dance of violence and commerce with nervous eyes. Spain feared Ottoman expansion. The Habsburgs schemed to exploit the rift, and England's fledgling navy eyed the spice routes with envy. But after nearly a century of intermittent war, exhaustion began to creep in. The Ottomans, stretched thin from wars on multiple fronts, could no longer afford endless campaigns in the mountains of Kurdistan. The Safavids, though resilient, saw their treasury drained by constant mobilization. Even the land itself seemed to rebel, crop failures, rebellions, and the slow grind of attrition made the cost of conflict unbearable. The Mediterranean world was reaching a breaking point, though no one yet knew that the solution would come not from a battlefield, but from a dusty plain near Zuhab, where diplomats would gamble on an untested peace. The roots of the Treaty of Zuhab stretch back over a century, to the sun-scorched plains of Chaldiran in 1514, where the Ottoman Sultan Selim I clashed with Shah Ismail of the Safavids in one of history's most consequential battles. The Ottomans, armed with European cannons and disciplined janissaries, shattered the Safavid cavalry, a devastating blow that marked the beginning of a bitter rivalry. But Chaldiran was just the first act in a grueling cycle of revenge. Over the next 120 years, the two empires would lock horns again and again, turning the Fertile Crescent into a battleground where cities like Tabriz and Baghdad became prizes to be won, lost, and won once more. By the 1630s, the cost of this endless conflict had become impossible to ignore. The Ottoman treasury, strained by wars on the European front and rebellions in Anatolia, could no longer sustain costly eastern campaigns. Meanwhile, the Safavids, though resilient, faced their own crises: crop failures, tribal uprisings, and the slow erosion of their once formidable military. Even the soldiers on both sides grew weary. Veterans who had spent their lives marching between Mesopotamia and the Caucasus now whispered of a war with no victors, only survivors. Then came the siege of Baghdad in 1638, a brutal, year-long struggle that would prove to be the final spark. The Ottomans, under Sultan Murad IV, recaptured the city after decades of Safavid control, but the victory came at a staggering human cost. Stories spread of streets choked with rubble, of civilians starving behind the walls, of entire regiments decimated by disease. When the dust settled, even the triumphant Ottomans knew something had to change. The time for posturing was over, and so, in the shadow of these exhausted armies, a quiet drama unfolded. Secret envoys began slipping between the two courts, their missions so delicate that many traveled in disguise. One such messenger, a Kurdish scholar named Ahmad Pasha, became the unlikely linchpin of the peace process. Fluent in both Turkish and Persian, respected by Sunni and Shia alike, he navigated the treacherous politics of both empires with rare skill. For months, he shuttled between tents in the Kurdish highlands, carrying proposals and counter-proposals, soothing egos, and finding common ground where others saw only division. The real breakthrough came in the spring of 1639, when senior diplomats from both sides finally met face-to-face near Zuhab. The location itself was symbolic, a neutral strip of land between the warring powers, far from the blood-soaked battlefields that had defined their relationship for generations. Here, men who had spent their lives as enemies shared meals under the same stars, debating not just borders but the future of the region. And watching over it all was the mysterious figure of Saru Khan, a Kurdish chieftain whose influence bridged both worlds. His role in the negotiations remains shrouded in legend, but one thing is clear: without his cunning diplomacy, the treaty might never have been signed. What emerged from these talks was more than just a ceasefire. It was a blueprint for a new era, one where trade would replace raids, where caravans could cross frontiers without fear, where the Mediterranean's eastern flank might finally know stability. Yet for all its ambition, the Treaty of Zuhab was also a product of its time, shaped by the weary pragmatism of men who had seen too much war to believe in permanent peace. The real test would come in the years ahead, as both empires struggled to turn ink on parchment into a lasting reality. The two men who finally put their seals on the Treaty of Zuhab could hardly have been more different. On the Ottoman side stood Sultan Murad IV, a ruler forged in blood and iron, a man so feared that his own subjects whispered he could kill with a single glance. Court chronicles tell us he once executed an entire orchestra for playing a wrong note and personally strangled his own brother to secure the throne. Yet this same tyrant, who spent his youth crushing rebellions and leading armies, became the unlikely architect of peace. By 1639, Murad was a shadow of his former self, wasting away from cirrhosis but still gripping power with skeletal fingers. His decision to negotiate came not from mercy, but cold calculation. Even a warrior king could see the empire was bleeding itself dry. Across the table sat Shah Safi I of Persia, a ruler whose reign was marked by stark contrast. Where Murad ruled through terror, Safi drifted through his days in an opium haze, leaving governance to his ministers. European ambassadors wrote of a Shah who barely spoke during audiences, his eyes glazed over as courtiers whispered decisions into his ear. Yet beneath this apparent weakness lay a cunning survivor, the same man who'd ordered the execution of his own family members to secure his throne. The treaty negotiations forced him into rare moments of clarity when the weight of history pierced through the fog of addiction. The real work, however, happened far from the thrones. Ottoman Grand Vizier Kemankesh Kara Mustafa Pasha, a former slave risen to power, brought ruthless pragmatism to the talks. Known for his photographic memory and mastery of administrative detail, he understood that lasting peace required more than lofty promises. It needed precise borders, clear trade terms, and enforceable guarantees. His counterpart, Safavid Chancellor Saru Taki, was equally formidable. A former shepherd turned political mastermind, he navigated the Shah's court like a chess grandmaster, securing concessions that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Their negotiations unfolded in coded letters and midnight meetings, with each clause hotly contested. The most explosive issue, the status of Baghdad, a city that had changed hands 7 times in a century. The Ottomans demanded full control, while the Safavids insisted on access to Shia holy sites. The compromise they forged was ingenious in its ambiguity: Ottoman sovereignty, but with guaranteed protections for Persian pilgrims. Similarly contentious were the Caucasus territories, where local Kurdish and Armenian lords played both empires against each other for generations. The solution: a carefully worded clause recognizing de facto control, rather than drawing rigid new borders, a diplomatic fudge that allowed both sides to claim victory. What made these terms revolutionary wasn't their boldness, but their restraint. For the first time, both empires acknowledged they couldn't annihilate each other. The treaty's genius lay in its quiet recognition of exhaustion, a document less about grand visions than practical coexistence. Yet as the ink dried, one question lingered: could these fragile agreements hold when the men who made them were gone? The answer would unfold in ways neither side could predict, reshaping the Mediterranean world far beyond the battlefield. The Treaty of Zuhab's text may have been written in the ornate script of 17th century diplomats, but its real power lay in the unspoken tensions between its lines. Article by article, it carved up the map with surgical precision, starting with the jagged spine of the Zagros Mountains, which became the new frontier between empires. These peaks weren't just geographical barriers, they were cultural divides, separating the sunny heartlands of the Ottomans from the Shia strongholds of Persia. The treaty's drafters knew better than to draw artificial lines through tribal territories, so they leaned into nature's own architecture, using rivers and ridgelines as boundaries. Yet even here, ambiguity crept in. The wording around the Mesopotamian plains, particularly around the contested city of Basra, was deliberately fuzzy, a diplomatic sleight of hand that allowed both sides to claim victory while storing up trouble for future generations. One of the treaty's most ingenious provisions dealt with faith rather than territory. Pilgrims from Persia would now have guaranteed safe passage to Shia holy sites in Ottoman Iraq, including the shrines of Najaf and Karbala. This wasn't just a religious concession, it was an economic masterstroke. The Safavids secured spiritual access, while the Ottomans gained control over the lucrative pilgrimage routes, taxing the endless flow of devotees. Even the prisoner exchange clauses revealed surprising pragmatism. Thousands of soldiers and civilians held captive on both sides, many for decades, were to be released in staged repatriations. But the real stroke of genius, a joint commission to verify identities, preventing warlords from ransoming random peasants as high-value captives. What made these terms revolutionary wasn't their boldness, but their restraint. The treaty didn't pretend to resolve centuries of animosity, it simply created channels for coexistence. Trade caravans could now cross borders without paying extortionate tolls, provided they flew the correct safe conduct flags. Local Kurdish chieftains, long used to playing both empires against each other, found themselves forced to choose allegiances as the new border hardened. And yet, for all its careful drafting, the document's vaguest passages would haunt the region. The Mesopotamian clauses, which referred to Ottoman control as historical and customary rather than absolute, left just enough room for future shahs to claim their ancestors had been duped. The maps drawn at Zuhab tell a silent story of endurance. That zigzagging border through the mountains didn't just last for years, it held for centuries, surviving dynastic collapses and colonial meddling, only to resurface in the 20th century as the modern Iran-Iraq frontier. But in the spring of 1639, no one was thinking in such grand timelines. As the ink dried, the real question was whether exhausted soldiers and skeptical merchants would believe in this fragile peace. The first test came just weeks later, when a caravan of Persian pilgrims approached Baghdad under the new treaty's protection. Ottoman guards, accustomed to seeing Safavid subjects as enemies, hesitated before lowering their muskets. That moment, more than any parchment, marked the true beginning of Zuhab's legacy. The ink on the Treaty of Zuhab had barely dried when its first cracks began to show. For warlords along the new frontier, peace was less a reality than an inconvenience, a temporary pause in the age-old game of raiding and plunder. In the rugged highlands between Ottoman Mosul and Safavid Hamadan, Kurdish chieftains who'd spent generations playing both empires against each other now found their livelihoods threatened by the treaty's neat borders. One such leader, the notorious Ali Khan of Soran, became the era's defining rogue. Just months after the treaty's signing, his horsemen ambushed a merchant caravan carrying Persian silks through the so-called neutral zone, slaughtering guards and disappearing into the mountains with enough loot to fund another year of rebellion. When Ottoman and Safavid officials jointly demanded justice, Ali Khan merely laughed, taunting them with a question that cut to the heart of Zuhab's fragility. Which of you owns the wind that blows between your borders? Merchants, meanwhile, played a riskier game. For the first time in living memory, Armenian traders from Aleppo could legally transport goods directly to Isfahan without paying crushing wartime tariffs. But the roads remained deadly. Bandits like Ali Khan were only part of the problem. Corrupt local governors on both sides often ignored the treaty's safe passage guarantees, demanding unofficial tolls that sometimes exceeded the old wartime taxes. The diary of one Venetian spice merchant, uncovered in the archives of Baghdad, tells of a 1640 journey where he paid bribes to 3 different Ottoman garrison commanders, 2 Kurdish tribal leaders, and a Safavid customs officer, all while flying the treaty's supposedly protected flag. Beneath these surface tensions, a more dangerous reality simmered. Both empires were quietly rearming. Ottoman shipyards in Izmir doubled their output of naval stores in the 5 years after Zuhab, while Safavid agents secretly purchased English cannon molds through Dutch intermediaries. The treaty had bought time, not trust. In Istanbul, Grand Vizier Kemenkesh Kara Mustafa Pasha, architect of the peace, found himself fighting whispers that he'd gone soft on the Persians. His solution, a clandestine campaign to strengthen frontier forts along the new border, disguising the constructions as road repairs to avoid provoking the Safavids. Yet for all these shadows, the treaty's greatest impact was unfolding in places no diplomat had anticipated. The same Armenian merchant who cursed the bandits and bribes also recorded something extraordinary in his ledger. 1641 marked the first year his trade profits exceeded pre-war levels. Slowly, erratically, the Mediterranean's eastern economy was rewiring itself. Persian carpets now reached Cairo in weeks rather than months. Ottoman copper, once hoarded for cannon making, flowed into Safavid workshops crafting the intricate astrolabes prized by European navigators. Even the humble coffee bean found new routes. Yemeni traders who'd once relied on Red Sea routes now sent caravans overland through Basra, knowing the treaty's protections made the journey worth the risk. The most telling symbol of this transformation wasn't in a ledger or fortress, but in the shifting sands of the Mesopotamian delta. Near the contested town of Mandoli, where Ottoman and Safavid border stones stood just a day's march apart, a spontaneous marketplace sprang up. By day, farmers from both empires bartered dates and wheat under the watchful eyes of rival soldiers. By night, those same soldiers would slip across the lines to gamble and share stories around fires. No clause in the Treaty of Zuhab had planned for this. It was the work of ordinary people tired of war, hungry for connection, testing whether parchment promises could become something real. The Treaty of Zuhab did more than silence cannons. It rewired the veins of commerce that pulsed across the Mediterranean. With borders stabilized for the first time in generations, the ancient Silk Roads roared back to life, but with a twist. Armenian merchants, long relegated to the shadows of wartime uncertainty, emerged as the era's unsung power brokers. In the bazaars of Isfahan, their warehouses bulged with Persian silk destined for Aleppo, where savvy traders like the Wartanian family built networks stretching from the Caspian to the Adriatic. Their ledgers tell the story. Where once caravans crept forward under armed escort, now they moved in unguarded trains of 50 mules or more, their bells ringing across mountain passes that had been death traps a decade earlier. Customs records from Smyrna reveal the staggering scale of this revival. By 1660, Persian silk flowing through Ottoman ports had tripled, flooding European markets and collapsing prices in Venice's once dominant warehouses. Venice's decline was the shockwave no one predicted. For centuries, the Serenissima had monopolized the spice and silk trade, its galleys threading through war zones to profit from scarcity. Now, with overland routes secure, their middlemen were cut out of the equation. A desperate 1643 memo from the Venetian Senate complained of Armenian caravans undercutting their prices by 60%. While English factors in Aleppo bypassed Mediterranean markups entirely, shipping goods directly around Africa. The real victors, the English East India Company, whose agents in Isfahan used the treaty's stability to negotiate direct deals with Safavid weavers. By 1655, company records show Persian silk accounted for nearly half their Asian imports, a tectonic shift that bankrolled London's rise as a global trading power. Yet the most profound changes weren't in ledgers, but in the cultural alchemy of border towns. In Aleppo's Khan al-Gumruk, Armenian and Persian merchants shared coffee with Ottoman officials, their conversations peppered with borrowed words that would seep into local dialects. Persian motifs began appearing in Damascus metalwork, while Isfahan's mosques incorporated Ottoman tile patterns, a quiet artistic détente. Even the humble caravanserai transformed. Where once these way stations had high walls and iron gates, post-Zuhab renovations added lush gardens and public baths, designed to attract merchants rather than repel marauders. The treaty hadn't just reopened trade routes, it created a world where a Persian poet could recite verses in an Aleppo courtyard, his words translated by an Armenian trader for a Turkish patron, all while English factors took notes for their next shipment. Commerce, it turned out, was the most durable diplomacy. The ink of the Treaty of Zuhab might have drawn borders, but its quietest revolution unfolded in the spaces between, where brushes met parchment, where poetry filled candlelit rooms, where the very soul of the Mediterranean world began to remake itself. In the hushed scriptoria of Topkapi Palace, Ottoman miniaturists who once glorified battlefield victories now turned their gaze eastward, weaving Safavid-inspired gardens into their illuminations. Delicate Persian tulips unfurled alongside Ottoman cypresses in manuscripts like the Siyar-i Nebai, their pigments mixed from the same lapis lazuli that once adorned Shah Abbas's court. This wasn't mere imitation, it was alchemy. The rigid formalism of Ottoman art softened under the influence of Safavid lyricism, while Persian artists, long isolated by war, suddenly gained access to Ottoman advances in perspective and portraiture. A single page from a 1652 anthology held in Vienna tells the story. Here, a battle scene dissolves into a margin where Ottoman and Persian painters collaborated on a border of intertwined vines, their styles indistinguishable. Coffee houses became the treaty's unofficial ambassadors. In Istanbul's Totakale district, Persian dervishes recited Rumi's verses to crowds of janissaries and merchants, their performances punctuated by the clink of Armenian-made porcelain cups. The poet Vashi Bafki, once a refugee fleeing Safavid purges, now held court in these smoky rooms, his ghazals blending Persian metaphors with Ottoman Turkish wordplay. When a visiting Venetian envoy asked why such former enemies gathered here nightly, a Greek dragoman whispered the perfect answer: war divides thrones, but poetry conquers hearts. No one embodied this intellectual thought more powerfully than Katib Celebi, the Ottoman polymath whose world maps redrew mental borders. Before Zuhab, Ottoman geographers depicted Persia as a blank expanse labeled land of heresy. But Celebi, poring over smuggled Safavid atlases and debriefing Armenian traders, produced his magnum opus, the Sihanuma. This revolutionary work integrated Persian place names and caravan routes with Ottoman naval charts, acknowledging Safavid scholarship for the first time. His copperplate engraving of the Caspian Sea, based on secret surveys by Persian astronomers, remained the standard for European mapmakers well into the 18th century. Even religion, the most volatile fault line, saw unexpected détente. In Najaf and Karbala, Ottoman officials who once barred Safavid pilgrims now collected taxes from their bustling hostels. Sunni and Shia scholars gathered in Edirne's theological schools for muted debates, no longer branding each other infidels, but passing legal nuances over cups of sherbet. The most symbolic gesture came in 1648, when an Ottoman convoy escorted a gift from Shah Abbas II to Mecca, a gold-embroidered kiswa cloth for the Kaaba, its silk woven by Isfahan's master calligraphers with verses honoring both caliphs and imams. For the first time in Islamic history, the holiest site in Sunni Islam bore the handiwork of Shia artisans, a fragile thread of unity spun from decades of strife. Yet this renaissance was always precarious. When Katib Celebi dared cite a Safavid historian in his chronicles, Istanbul's clerics accused him of polluting Ottoman ink with Persian lies. The coffeehouse poets walked a razor's edge. One misplaced verse about Ali or Omar could spark riots, and beneath the surface, old wounds festered. A 1654 incident in Erzurum revealed the limits of tolerance. Ottoman troops, discovering a Safavid caravan carrying not silks but illustrated manuscripts of Shia liturgy, burned the books and flogged the traders as spies. The treaty had opened doors, but centuries of dogma couldn't be erased in a generation. What emerged was neither harmony nor hostility, but something far more human, a grudging acknowledgement that culture, like commerce, refused to respect the lines men drew on maps. The Treaty of Zuhab contained an unspoken revolution, one hidden not in its territorial clauses, but in the quiet surrender of an idea. For over a century, Ottoman sultans had styled themselves as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy, their imperial decrees laced with venom against the heretical Safavid shahs. Yet in 1639, that rhetoric vanished from the diplomatic record. No fiery denunciations, no demands for Safavid conversion, just a pragmatic acknowledgement that Shia Islam would govern east of the Zagros Mountains. This wasn't merely tolerance, it was the crumbling of a foundational Ottoman claim, the pretense of universal Sunni authority. The ripple effects were most visible in the shrine cities of Iraq, where gold met dust in the mausoleums of Shia imams. Najaf, home to Ali's tomb, became the treaty's living laboratory. Under pre-Zuhab Ottoman rule, Safavid pilgrims had risked arrest or worse to reach its gilded dome. Now they arrived in caravans thousands strong, their passage protected by treaty clauses. Ottoman governors, once tasked with suppressing Shia rituals, found themselves overseeing the festival of Ashura not as enforcers, but as tax collectors. The ledgers of Najaf's Waqf administration tell a startling story. Between 1640 and 1650, donations from Persian pilgrims funded the doubling of the city's hostel capacity, while local Sunni artisans grew rich crafting ceremonial objects for Shia visitors. This uneasy coexistence bred strange alliances. In Karbala, Sunni Ottoman troops stood guard as Persian mourners reenacted the martyrdom of Hussein, the very event Sunni zealots had once disrupted with violence. The Safavids returned the gesture, permitting Sunni traders from Mosul to sell dates in the markets of Qom, provided they paid a special fraternal tax lighter than wartime tariffs. Neither side admitted this was religious pluralism. The Ottomans framed it as customary hospitality, the Safavids as temporary concessions, but the effect was the same. After generations of bloodshed, the Mediterranean's eastern flank was discovering the fragile art of sharing sacred space. Europe watched this détente with equal parts fascination and alarm. Venetian spies in Aleppo sent coded dispatches about the Persianization of Ottoman border towns, where coffee houses now served sherbet in Safavid-style glassware. The Habsburg ambassador to Istanbul warned Vienna that a united Islamic front might soon threaten Christendom, a paranoid fantasy, but one that shaped European diplomacy for decades. More perceptive observers, like the French merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, noted the real shift. The Turk and Persian still curse each other's faith over coffee, he wrote in 1656, but their curses grow polite and always end with counting coins. The treaty's true genius lay in its silence. By never explicitly recognizing Safavid Shiism as legitimate, the Ottomans saved face with their clerical establishment. By never demanding Sunni rights in Persia, the Safavids preserved their revolutionary identity. This diplomatic sleight of hand allowed bitter enemies to coexist without either abandoning their core beliefs, a lesson in conflict resolution that echoes far beyond the 17th century. Yet the arrangement had its limits. When a group of overzealous Safavid pilgrims tried to convert Sunni villagers near Samarra in 1651, Ottoman troops intervened with whips and chains. The message was clear: tolerance had boundaries, and they ended where political order began. What emerged from this tense equilibrium was something unprecedented, a Mediterranean world where sectarian identity became negotiable rather than absolute. Armenian merchants in Baghdad learned to adjust their speech, emphasizing Sunni or Shia sympathies depending on which official inspected their cargo. Kurdish tribesmen adopted a fluid religiosity, practicing Friday prayers with Ottoman magistrates one week and mourning Hussein with Safavid travelers the next. Even language itself adapted, as Persian loanwords for truce and compromise seeped into Ottoman bureaucratic jargon. The Treaty of Zuhab hadn't just redrawn borders, it had rewritten the rules of belonging, proving that even the deepest divisions could bend under the weight of exhaustion and self-interest. Europe's chancelleries erupted in quiet panic when news of the Treaty of Zuhab reached Vienna and Rome. Habsburg spies intercepting Ottoman dispatches from Aleppo decoded frantic warnings about a terrifying new reality. No longer could Christendom count on Muslim empires tearing each other apart. A secret 1640 memorandum from the papal nuncio in Warsaw captured the dread. The Turk and Persian, like Herod and Pilate, have made peace at our expense. Vatican theologians spun dark theories about an impending Islamic crusade, pointing to rumors that Safavid envoys had visited Istanbul's Topkapi Palace bearing gifts of jeweled Qurans. The irony was palpable after centuries of Catholic monarchs dreaming of a united Christian front against Islam. Europe now faced the nightmare scenario of its enemies achieving unity first. Yet in the counting houses of Amsterdam and Antwerp, merchants toasted with Persian wine to a very different future. Dutch East India Company ledgers from 1641 reveal a startling surge in silk imports, not through traditional Venetian middlemen, but directly from Armenian caravans crossing the newly secure Ottoman Safavid frontier. One factor's letter home giddily reported Persian brocades selling at 60% below Lisbon prices, adding, "The Turk and Persian may hate each other still, but their hatred now fills our purses." For these pragmatic capitalists, the treaty wasn't a threat but an opportunity, cracking open markets that war had kept shuttered for generations. The real revolution, however, unfolded in Europe's arsenals. With Persian silk flooding markets and undercutting Mediterranean monopolies, warring states suddenly found their treasuries stretched. The Spanish response was telling. Their Milanese armories, once focused on producing pikes and breastplates for Holy League campaigns, pivoted to precision engineering. A surviving 1645 inventory from the Duchy of Mantua shows arquebuses giving way to prototype flintlock muskets, their mechanisms refined by gunsmiths who'd formerly decorated ceremonial armor for Habsburg emperors. The Venetians, desperate to counter their declining trade revenues, made an even bolder gamble. Their secret alliance with Kurdish rebels smuggling Ottoman firearms blueprints led to the famed Arsenal Revolt, a 1646 incident where veteran shipwrights, ordered to shift from galley construction to standardized cannon foundries, nearly burned down the dockyards rather than abandon centuries of tradition. Military innovation wasn't confined to Christendom. Ottoman armorers in Damascus, no longer consumed by mass-producing weapons for Eastern campaigns, began experimenting with volley fire techniques adapted from Dutch drill manuals acquired through Armenian traders in Smyrna. The Safavids made their own leap forward, replacing their iconic but unwieldy camel-mounted Zamburak cannons with Swedish-style light field guns purchased through Russian intermediaries. A curious footnote survives in the travelogue of an English mercenary visiting Isfahan in 1650. He described Persian artillery crews practicing alongside renegade janissaries, their shared Turkish-Persian commands creating a pidgin language of war. This unintended arms race revealed the treaty's deepest paradox by freezing one conflict. It accelerated transformations far beyond the battlefield. The same merchants who profited from peace became conduits for military knowledge, their cargo holds carrying both silk samples and stolen sketches of fortifications. When the Habsburgs finally abandoned their dreams of crusade in 1652, opting instead to fortify the Croatian border with new star-shaped bastions, they unknowingly adopted design elements from Ottoman engineers who had themselves borrowed from Italian treatises captured at the Siege of Baghdad. The Mediterranean's military landscape was becoming a hall of mirrors, where every innovation reflected distant decisions made by weary diplomats at Zuhab a decade earlier. Yet for all the geopolitical tremors, the most telling reaction came not from kings or merchants, but from an unlikely observer, Galileo Galilei. Under house arrest in Arcetri, the aging astronomer received smuggled reports about Persian celestial charts being studied in Istanbul. His last known letter, penned weeks before his death in 1642, mused that the stars care not for treaties, yet men who once mapped war now measure the heavens together. In those words lay the treaty's unspoken legacy, not just a redrawn map, but a rewired imagination where former enemies could envision futures beyond eternal conflict. The cannons that fell silent after the Treaty of Zuhab didn't stay quiet for long, they simply found new targets. With the eastern frontier stabilized, both empires pivoted their war machines westward, pouring saved resources into military innovations that would reshape the next century of conflict. In Damascus, Ottoman foundries that once churned out cannonballs for Persian campaigns now experimented with a terrifying new invention: standardized bore sizes. Master armorer Ibrahim Effendi, a former slave from Hungary, pioneered techniques to cast guns with interchangeable parts, decades before European armies adopted the practice. His 1645 ledger, preserved in Istanbul's military archives, records test fires of 42 identical guns shooting 42 identical balls, a feat that stunned Venetian observers. Meanwhile, along the Danube frontier, Janissary drill masters incorporated volley fire techniques learned from Dutch deserters, creating disciplined firing lines that could unleash 3 shots per minute, a rate unmatched until Prussia's rise. The Safavids answered with their own deadly innovations. Shah Abbas II, no longer bleeding troops in Mesopotamia, secretly hired Italian engineers from the collapsing Gonzaga court. These renegade Christians paid in gold and promised protection taught Persian sappers the geometry of Vauban-style star forts. By 1650, Isfahan's workshops were producing lightweight brass mortars based on Swedish designs, smuggled in via Armenian merchants posing as antique dealers. The most audacious project, a secret artillery school near Kazvin, where European mercenaries trained Safavid gunners to calculate trajectories using astrolabes adapted from Persian astronomy texts. When these modernized forces later clashed with Mughal armies in Kandahar, their precision bombardments shattered entire regiments before cavalry could even charge. This military revolution came at a brutal human cost. The same foundries producing Damascus's miracle guns relied on coerced labor Christian prisoners from Balkan wars and Kurdish tribesmen pressed into service. A haunting 1648 petition from Anatolian villagers complains of "our sons taken for the Sultan's furnace works, returning blind from sparks or dead from molten metal." Safavid modernization proved equally merciless. To build their new siege trains, Shah Abbas ordered mass conscription of Armenian artisans, separating families and relocating them under guard to Isfahan's fortified workshops. Those who resisted faced the Shah's signature punishment, being sealed alive inside the very cannons they refused to craft. The treaty's forgotten casualties extended beyond battlefields and workshops. Along the newly stabilized border, entire communities found their livelihoods erased overnight. Kurdish mercenaries who'd grown rich escorting caravans through war zones now begged outside mosques. In Aleppo, armorers who once repaired musket stocks for Ottoman campaigns turned to making wooden clogs, their workshops littered with unused gunpowder flasks. Most tragic were the thousands of war captives left in limbo. Persian soldiers stranded in Ottoman Baghdad after prisoner exchanges stalled, their letters home pleading, "We are neither dead nor living, but ghosts in a peace no one remembers to enforce." Perhaps no story captures this dissonance better than that of Master Gunner Ali Reza, a Safavid artilleryman captured at Baghdad. Granted clemency under the treaty, he was put to work training Ottoman crews. Years later, when his former Persian comrades besieged the same fortress he'd helped defend, witnesses reported him silently adjusting cannon angles to deliberately overshoot their lines. A small act of mercy in an era where peace had changed everything except the human heart. While sultans and shahs toasted their newfound peace in palace courtyards, the Treaty of Zuhab carved silent wounds through mountain villages and ancient kingdoms. Nowhere was this betrayal more keenly felt than among the Kurdish emirs who had played both empires against each other for generations. The semi-independent principality of Bitlis, ruled by the proud Sharaf Khan dynasty, became collateral damage overnight, its strategic valleys handed to the Ottomans in exchange for Persian concessions further south. A haunting folk melody still sung in southeastern Turkey preserves their outrage. The ink dried before our horses could gallop, the sultans traded our peaks for their peace. The Georgian kings fared even worse. For centuries, these Christian rulers had navigated the Muslim empire's rivalry with cunning diplomacy, offering tribute to both while preserving their autonomy. The Treaty of Zuhab shattered that balancing act. Shah Safi, desperate to secure Ottoman recognition of his Persian gains, abandoned his Georgian vassals without a second thought. In the Alpine fortress of Sarami, King Teimuraz I received the news while examining a Safavid gift sword, the same blade he would later plunge into a Persian envoy's chest when ordered to surrender his artillery. His subsequent rebellion collapsed within months, but the folk ballads of Kakheti still recount his doomed stand. They wrote our mountains away with a stranger's pen, while our eagles circled above the treason. One family's exodus encapsulates this human cost. The Burwari clan, Kurdish chieftains whose ancestors had ruled the rugged lands between Mosul and Urmia for 300 years, found their homeland bisected by the new border. Forced to choose between Ottoman or Safavid allegiance, Patriarch Sheikh Ahmed led 800 followers on a grueling trek westward. A surviving caravan journal details their 2-year odyssey, elderly women dying in mountain passes, children born under makeshift tents. The clan's prized Arabian stallions traded for safe passage through hostile territories. When they finally reached the Anatolian plateau near Kayseri, Ottoman officials granted them barren lands in recognition of past service. The sheikh's bitter remark entered family lore. They gave us dust to replace the rivers we bled for. Yet the treaty's knife cut deeper than politics. It scarred the land itself. With the Zagros Mountains now a formal border, centuries-old migration routes for Kurdish shepherds were abruptly severed. Annual treks that once followed the spring grasses from Mesopotamia to the Armenian highlands became impossible, forcing herds into overgrazed lowlands. Ottoman tax records from Diyarbakir show a 20% drop in wool production within 5 years, while Persian accounts describe erosion choking once fertile valleys. The environmental toll extended beyond pastoral life. The famed oak forests of Loristan, long managed through communal Kurdish stewardship, fell victim to uncontrolled logging as Safavid officials rushed to build frontier forts. By 1650, travelers reported entire slopes stripped bare, their timber converted into barracks for soldiers guarding a border that hadn't existed a generation earlier. Most haunting of all was the fate of the Murat River. This vital waterway, whose headwaters rose in the treaty-divided highlands, became a hydrographic casualty. Ottoman engineers diverted its flow to irrigate new cotton plantations near Elazig, while Persian Qanat builders siphoned its tributaries for borderland vineyards. By the 18th century, the river's lower reaches, once the lifeblood of Armenian monasteries and Assyrian fishing villages, had shrunk to a trickle. The treaty's invisible hand had not just moved borders on maps, it had rewritten the very ecology of a region, proving that peace could be as disruptive as war when drawn without regard for the people and landscapes that would bear its weight. The borderlands between the Ottoman and Safavid empires had never been a place of straight lines until the Treaty of Zuhab forced them into existence. For generations, Kurdish and Turkmen tribes moved with the seasons, their flocks following ancient grazing routes that meandered across the Zagros Mountains like threads in a tapestry. These migrations weren't just journeys, they were a delicate dance with the land, honed over centuries to prevent overgrazing. But when the treaty's ink dried, that dance was abruptly halted. Suddenly, the highland pastures of Hakkari, where shepherds had moved flocks between summer and winter grounds for 1,000 years, were sliced in two by an invisible frontier. Ottoman border guards stationed in newly built stone watchtowers turned back tribesmen with a brutal simplicity. Your grazing permits are for the other side now. The consequences were as swift as they were devastating. With traditional routes blocked, herds piled into the few accessible valleys, stripping the land bare. A Persian provincial governor's report from 1642 paints a grim picture. The grass vanishes before it can seed, the earth cracks like old pottery, and the flocks grow thin as shadows. Famine followed. In the village of Beyne, nestled on the now divided slopes, elders spoke of winters where children gnawed on boiled leather straps for sustenance. But the most tragic irony, the very forts enforcing these borders relied on the tribes they displaced. Kurdish stonemasons, once hired to build Safavid caravanserais, now found themselves constructing walls that would pen in their own people. Deforestation spread like a slow fever. The Zagros Mountains, whose oak forests had sheltered generations of shepherds, became a logistical battleground. Ottoman engineers needed timber for frontier palisades. Safavid artillery required charcoal for smelting cannonballs. By 1650, entire swaths of the highlands stood denuded, their stumps littering hillsides like broken teeth. French botanist Pierre Bellon, traveling through the region in 1653, described the eerie silence where birds once nested. The axes never cease, and with each fallen tree, the springs grow weaker. His notes include a chilling observation. The Murat River, once fed by forest-retained rains, had dropped so low that fish could be plucked from its shallows by hand. Yet the treaty's ecological wounds ran deeper than anyone anticipated. Without nomadic shepherds to prune them, wild pistachio trees overtook abandoned grazing lands, their dense thickets choking out the diverse flora that had sustained bees for generations. Beekeeping, a cornerstone of Kurdish and Lur cultures for millennia, collapsed in the span of a decade. Tax records from the Sanjak of Mosul show honey production plummeting by 80% between 1640 and 1650, a loss that rippled through local economies, from candle makers to medicinal syrup brewers. By the 18th century, these disruptions had calcified into irreversible change. European maps from 1720 show the borderlands labeled with ominous new terms: Deserta Ottomanica near Van, terra disputata around Qasr-e-Shirin. The land itself had become a casualty of peace, but the most telling legacy lay in the stories passed down through generations. A Lur folk tale from the Zagros tells of a shepherd who dared cross the forbidden border to reach a legendary spring. When caught by Ottoman soldiers, he offered not gold or pleas, but a simple question: does the grass know which empire it grows for? The answer, like the treaty itself, was written in the dust that now covered what had once been fertile earth. The peace bought by the Treaty of Zuhab lasted just long enough for history to forget its fragile foundations. By the 1730s, the Mediterranean world had changed beyond recognition. European powers now dominated global trade. The Safavid dynasty had crumbled into chaos, and a new warlord named Nadir Shah rose from Persia's ashes with an army hungry for revenge. What happened next wasn't just another war, but a grotesque replay of history. Ottoman archivists, digging through dusty scrolls to prepare their defenses, made a chilling discovery. The maps Nadir Shah's generals were using to plot their invasion matched almost perfectly with those drawn at Zuhab a century earlier. The same river fords, the same mountain passes, even the same crumbling fortresses, all waiting like unfinished business. The irony was almost poetic. Nadir's cavalry thundered across the Murat River at the exact crossing point Ottoman and Safavid negotiators had haggled over in 1639. His siege engineers found Baghdad's weakest walls where Ottoman records predicted, because those vulnerabilities had been noted during the treaty's border surveys. Even the supply routes his armies followed traced paths first established by the Armenian merchants who'd flourished during Zuhab's brief peace. The past hadn't just repeated itself, it had been preserved in amber, ready to ignite at the first spark. Ottoman commanders, scrambling to respond, realized too late how deeply Zuhab's ambiguities still haunted them. That vague clause about customary grazing rights in the Zagros Mountains. Kurdish tribes now used it as justification to switch sides mid-battle, arguing their ancestors had never truly accepted the border, the carefully worded pilgrim protections for Shia shrines. Nadir's propagandists twisted them into claims of Ottoman oppression, rallying thousands to his banner. Worst of all were the river disputes, particularly around the Shat al-Arab waterway, where Zuhab's negotiators had dodged the issue by calling it a matter for local governors. A century of competing irrigation projects had turned the region into a tinderbox, with Persian farmers and Ottoman date growers battling over every canal. Archival letters from this period reveal a growing desperation. An Ottoman frontier governor warned Istanbul in 1732 that Nadir's scouts were asking villagers about the old boundary stones from the time of Sultan Murad, as if excavating some ancient curse. Meanwhile, Persian military engineers pored over captured Ottoman maps, marveling at how little the strategic landscape had changed, the most telling detail. Both sides still referred to key positions by their 1639 names, proof that Zuhab's geography had ossified into military doctrine. When the dust settled after Nadir's retreat, the Mediterranean world faced an unsettling truth. The treaty hadn't just ended a war, it had frozen a conflict in place like a paused chess game waiting for the next player. 19th century diplomats inheriting this mess would confront eerily familiar problems. British surveyors mapping the Ottoman-Persian border in 1843 stumbled upon Kurdish clans still citing Zuhab's grazing clauses to defy both empires. Russian mediators arbitrating water rights in 1870 found villagers producing yellowed parchments they claimed were copies of the original treaty. Even the League of Nations, redrawing borders after World War I, discovered that local leaders in Mosul appealed not to modern law, but to the eternal boundaries established in 1639. The ultimate legacy of Zuhab wasn't peace or war, but something far more persistent, a blueprint for how empires draw lines without truly parting ways. Like a river that vanishes underground only to resurface miles downstream, its unresolved tensions flowed silently through the centuries, emerging whenever the ground grew thin enough to hear them rushing beneath. When British diplomat Mark Sykes unrolled his map of the Middle East in 1916, he wasn't drawing arbitrary lines, he was tracing ghosts. The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, which carved up the Ottoman Empire into colonial spheres, leaned heavily on a 400-year-old template, the Treaty of Zuhab's borders. Declassified Foreign Office memos reveal how British cartographers pored over 17th-century Ottoman-Persian frontier records, searching for natural divisions to justify their modern partition. That zigzagging line through the Zagros Mountains, lifted directly from the 1639 negotiations, the contested Shatt al-Arab waterway, its ambiguous status in Zuhab became the perfect pretext for British control of Basra's oil fields. Colonial archivists even noted with satisfaction how Kurdish tribal territories, once bisected by the old treaty, could again be exploited as buffer zones, proof that some borders never truly fade, they just wait for new empires to repurpose them. This colonial repackaging of ancient frontiers exposed a stark contrast in worldviews. Where Zuhab's negotiators had haggled over grazing rights and pilgrimage routes, Sykes and Picot treated populations like chess pieces, Armenians here, Arabs there, Kurds scattered wherever they wouldn't interfere with pipelines. A telling 1917 telegram from Cairo to London complained that local leaders kept invoking the time of Sultan Murad's peace when protesting the new borders, forcing British officers to dig into Istanbul's archives to counter their arguments. The irony was palpable. Europe's self-proclaimed modernizers were simultaneously erasing and weaponizing history, dismissing Middle Eastern diplomats as backward while plagiarizing their 4-century-old border solutions. Yet the most enduring damage lay in cultural memory. For generations, Kurdish storytellers had preserved Zuhab not as a betrayal, but as a cautionary tale about external meddling, their oral epics recounting how Sharaf Khan of Bitlis warned that peace written in distant capitals bleeds the land dry. Now, those same narratives fused with anger at Sykes-Picot, creating a potent historical echo. Persian constitutionalists in 1920 cited Zuhab's pilgrim protections when demanding British respect for Shia shrines in Iraq. Ottoman officers defending Mosul presented yellowed treaty copies to League of Nations inspectors as proof of Turkish historical claims. Even the oil concession maps drawn by Anglo-Persian oil company engineers bore uncanny resemblances to 17th-century caravan route surveys made possible by Zuhab's brief peace. The ultimate tragedy wasn't that colonial powers redrew borders, it's that they did so without understanding the living history embedded in those lines. When a British political officer named Arnold Wilson dismissed Kurdish complaints in 1919 by saying, "These mountain folk have no concept of nationhood," he failed to grasp how deeply they understood the Zagros frontier not as a colonial imposition, but as a scar from a wound they'd spent centuries trying to heal. Today, when scholars scrutinize Sykes-Picot's legacy, they're not just analyzing a 20th-century blunder, they're witnessing the long shadow of a treaty signed when Shakespeare's plays were still fresh in London's theaters, its unresolved tensions resurrected by men who never bothered to read past the first page of the story they were rewriting. Long after the ink on the Treaty of Zuhab faded, its memory burned bright in the songs of wandering Ashik's Azerbaijani bards whose ballads turned diplomats into legends. In dimly lit caravanserais from Tabriz to Trebizond, these storytellers spun tales of Saru Khan, the Kurdish mediator who became folklore's ultimate trickster. One popular ballad describes him outwitting both empires by hiding the treaty's true map inside a loaf of bread, singing, "The fox knows the henhouse has two doors, but only one leads to the river of peace." The real negotiator would have hardly recognized himself in these embellished versions, his cautious diplomacy transformed into heroic escapades where he rides winged horses over contested mountains or charms Ottoman and Safavid envoys into sharing a single cup of coffee. Turkish shadow theater added its own mythical layers. In the ramshackle puppet stalls of old Istanbul, Karagöz the sly everyman often reenacted Zuhab's negotiations as a comic duel between two stubborn shepherds. The punchline, their sheep end up so entangled in the border ropes that the animals broke a peace by grazing together. These playful retellings carried sharp truths. When Karagöz quips, even the rain falls differently on each side of the Sultan's line. Audiences laughed while absorbing a subtle critique of artificial divisions. The treaty's spirit survives most powerfully in proverbs still whispered across the region. Persian carpet weavers in Kerman murmur, "No knot stays tied forever, except the one at Zuhab," as their fingers work intricate borders into rugs. Kurdish elders warning against grudges invoke, "Even enemies must drink from the same river," a direct nod to the treaty's shared water rights. These sayings crystallize a profound truth. What began as a political compromise became woven into the fabric of daily life, transforming legal clauses into cultural touchstones. Archaeologists tracing these echoes made a startling discovery in 2018. During roadworks near the old border town of Kasr-e laborers uncovered a caravanserai courtyard with 17th century graffiti. Scratched into the stone were crude maps marking Murad's line, alongside game boards, evidence that merchants waiting out sandstorms passed time playing strategy games based on the treaty's borders. Nearby, someone had carved a line from poet Said Tabrizi. "They drew a valley between two mountains, but my heart crosses it daily." These fragile markings, preserved under layers of dust, prove how deeply Zuhab seeped into the region's subconscious long after its signatories turned to dust. Buried beneath the shifting sands near Kasr-e a team of archaeologists made a discovery that would make historians catch their breath. Two weathered stone pillars, each taller than a man, standing just 10 paces apart. On one, Ottoman calligraphy spiraled in elegant Arabic script, marking the boundary as the eternal line of Sultan Murad's justice. On the other, Safavid masons had carved flowing Persian verses praising Shah Safi as the shadow of God on earth. These silent sentinels, half buried for centuries, weren't just border markers, they were frozen arguments, their inscriptions still debating sovereignty across the dust. The real shock came when infrared scans revealed something hidden beneath the surface. The stones were carved from the same quarry, their mineral signatures matching perfectly. Even as empires postured, the land itself refused to be divided. Then came the Paris auction scandal of 2019. A leather-bound folio labeled Persian Miscellany appeared at Drawat's auction house, its pages dismissed as ornamental until a sharp-eyed historian noticed water stains matching Ottoman court documents. Inside were not poems, but the original drafts of Zuhab's territorial clauses, complete with marginal notes in Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa's cramped handwriting. One scribbled aside changed everything. "The Kurdish delegates weep when we speak of Soran, but the Shah's men will not budge. Let us right tribal lands and let the mountains decide." These weren't just bureaucratic records, they were confessionals revealing how much of the treaty was improvised theater. The most explosive find, a torn scrap pinned to the back cover, a Safavid sketch map showing secret water tunnels under Baghdad, labeled "for leverage if they betray." Modern surveyors working along the Iran-Iraq border have stumbled upon eerie echoes of these ancient games. In 2021, a UN team verifying mine-clearing progress found Kurdish farmers still using Ottoman-era boundary stones, now repurposed as irrigation markers, while Iranian border guards cited 16th-century Safavid land grants during disputes. The real revelation came from satellite imagery. The zigzagging modern frontier follows Zuhab's lines with 90% accuracy, proving that today's tensions are still choreographed by a 400-year-old dance. One geographer put it bluntly, "We're not drawing new borders, we're tracing the ghosts of old compromises." Perhaps the most haunting parallel lies in the treaty's unresolved ambiguities. Just as Zuhab's vague phrasing about customary grazing rights fueled centuries of conflict, modern oil contracts in the same region hinge on similarly slippery terms. When ExxonMobil and National Iranian Oil Company clashed over drilling rights near Basra in 2017, their lawyers dredged up 17th-century precedents. The court transcripts read like historical farce, American attorneys quoting Ottoman tax records, Persian engineers citing Safavid irrigation laws. Beneath the legal jargon, the same old question lingered: who really owns the earth when empires fall? The stones of Qasr-e-Shirin and the rediscovered folio both whisper the same uncomfortable truth. Borders are less about geography than memory. Every line drawn in ink or carved in stone carries the weight of choices made by exhausted men in dusty tents, their decisions echoing farther than they ever dreamed. Today's mapmakers might use satellites instead of sextants, but they're still wrestling with the same dilemmas: how to divide what the land itself insists on keeping whole. The Treaty of Zuhab didn't just end a war. It created a template for managing conflict that feels eerily familiar today. Look at Cyprus, where the Green Line has divided Greek and Turkish communities since 1974, or Kashmir's line of control, frozen in place since 1948. Like Zuhab's border through the Zagros Mountains, these modern ceasefire lines are less solutions than pauses, drawing temporary boundaries that harden into permanence. Historian Dr. Ayla Neftsi, who has studied both 17th-century Ottoman archives and UN mediation records, notes a crucial difference. Zuhab's negotiators accepted ambiguity as the price of peace. Today's diplomats treat it as a failure to be fixed. The result: modern conflicts remain perpetually unresolved, with neither the patience for long-term détente nor the flexibility to accommodate shifting realities. Take the Korean demilitarized zone, a ribbon of land where soldiers stare each other down across rows of landmines. Like the Ottoman Safavid frontier after 1639, it's become an accidental ecosystem where nature thrives in human absence. But unlike Zuhab's negotiators, who built economic and cultural bridges across their divide, 20th-century diplomats prioritized military containment over human connection. The cost of this approach is etched in the stories of families separated for generations, their reunions contingent on geopolitical whims. By contrast, Zuhab's pilgrim protections and trade clauses acknowledged that borders couldn't stop the flow of faith or commerce, a lesson modern peace processes often ignore. Yet the treaty's most profound legacy lies beyond the Middle East. When Spanish galleons began bypassing Mediterranean middlemen to sail directly for Manila after 1640, they were exploiting trade routes made viable by Zuhab's stability. The silver flowing from Potosi to Canton, the Persian carpets reaching Versailles, these global connections were underwritten by a peace most Europeans had never heard of. Even the tulip mania that nearly bankrupted Holland owed a debt to Zuhab. Safavid merchants, no longer dodging Ottoman patrols, could finally transport delicate bulbs intact to Anatolian markets, where Dutch traders acquired them. The treaty's ripple effects reached places its signatories couldn't have imagined, proving that local peace can have global consequences. Perhaps the most telling comparison lies in what historians call the Zuhab paradox, the way the treaty's very success sowed the seeds of future conflict. By freezing hostilities without resolving underlying tensions, it ensured that whenever new powers arose, they'd inherit old battle lines. We see this today in the South China Sea, where 19th-century maritime borders collide with 21st-century ambitions, or in Africa's Sahel region, where colonial boundaries ignore nomadic traditions just as Zuhab disregarded Kurdish migrations. The difference: 17th-century statesmen at least understood they were making imperfect compromises. As Dr. Neftsi observes, they left room for the land to speak. Modern maps pretend their lines are laws of nature. The final irony is that Zuhab's greatest lesson might be its humility. Unlike today's peace accords crammed with timelines and benchmarks, the treaty accepted that some conflicts can't be won, only managed. Its legacy isn't in the borders it drew, but in the space it created for life to continue around them. From the Armenian merchants who turned frontier towns into cosmopolitan hubs, to the Kurdish shepherds who quietly adapted their routes, ordinary people found ways to make the peace work where diplomats could only make it official. That's the untold story of frozen conflicts, not the lines on maps, but the lives that weave through them despite everything. The scent of Persian saffron wafting through Marseille's fish markets in 1641 wasn't just a culinary novelty, it was the smell of an economic earthquake. Before the Treaty of Zuhab, a single kilogram of Kashan's crimson threads took 18 months to reach Europe, passing through 23 sets of Ottoman and Safavid toll collectors, each demanding a slice of the profit. By the time Venetian merchants unloaded their precious cargo in Marseille, the price had ballooned to 12 times its Persian value, making saffron rarer than gold in European kitchens. But with Zuhab's trade clauses slashing border tariffs by 80%, everything changed. Armenian caravan masters like Artavasts of Yerevan could now chart daring new routes cutting straight from Isfahan through Ottoman Diyarbakir, then down the Euphrates to Aleppo, where French factors waited with ships ready to sprint across the Mediterranean. A surviving ledger from Marseille's Spice Guild records the shock. In just 2 years, saffron imports tripled, collapsing prices so abruptly that Provençal fish stews once seasoned with cheap Spanish safflower suddenly gleamed with authentic Persian gold. The real revolution, however, happened far from the docks. In the back kitchens of Parisian confectioners, Persian saffron's arrival sparked a frantic scramble for new techniques. French sugar boilers, accustomed to working with coarse Mediterranean varieties, struggled to handle the delicate Kashan strands that dissolved too quickly in their copper cauldrons. The solution came from an unexpected source, a renegade Safavid candy maker named Mirza Hassan, captured by Maltese pirates and sold to a Marseille patissier. His trick: adding rosewater to stabilize the saffron, a method perfected in Isfahan's royal kitchens. By 1650, this fusion of Persian chemistry and French pastry craft birthed the first true saffron macarons, their recipe smuggled to Versailles in a coded laundry list. Meanwhile, the saffron trade became a Trojan horse for stranger exchanges. French glassmakers in Toulon, desperate to replicate the airtight crystal jars Persian merchants used to preserve the spice's potency, reverse-engineered Safavid furnace designs from shards found in ship ballast. Their failed imitations, too brittle for transport, accidentally birthed a new industry: thin-walled perfume bottles that would make Grasse the fragrance capital of Europe. Even the humble corkscrew owes its Chinese letter to this cross-pollination. Basque coopers, frustrated by Persian saffron crates sealed with intricate Ottoman wax seals, developed a double spiral design based on Kurdish shepherd's rope braids, an innovation that later revolutionized wine culture. The most enduring transfer, though, was invisible. Persian caravan routes had long relied on a sophisticated system of way stations called chapar-khane, where riders exchanged exhausted horses for fresh mounts at precise intervals. French postal inspectors studying Armenian merchants' logistics adapted this model to create the relay poststocks, Europe's first coordinated mail network. By 1660, letters could travel from Lyon to Paris in 3 days instead of 3 weeks, their routes mirroring the saffron trails blazed by Artavast's descendants. What began as a quest for cheaper spices had redrawn the map of European communication, proving that peace treaties don't just move goods, they speed up the very flow of ideas. The siege engineers of Isfahan found themselves with idle hands after the Treaty of Zuhab, their expertise in tunneling beneath fortress walls suddenly obsolete. But where others saw unemployment, master hydrologist Sheikh Bahai saw opportunity. He repurposed teams of former sappers to tackle a challenge even more daunting than warfare, taming the Zayandeh River's erratic flows. Their secret weapon, smuggled Ottoman scrolls containing blueprints for Constantinople's advanced water distribution systems, acquired through Armenian merchants in exchange for Persian miniature paintings. The result was Isfahan's marvel of precision, the Tawhid Khane water clock, where carved stone channels measured time by the weight of flowing liquid, its accuracy rivaling European pendulum clocks. Visitors from Delhi to Damascus marveled as its automated bronze birds sang at each hour, unaware they were witnessing military engineering reborn as civic art. This hydraulic renaissance extended far beyond timekeeping. Along Isfahan's Chahar Bagh Avenue, Safavid engineers installed underground qanats based on Ottoman siphon principles, creating gravity-fed fountains that danced without pumps. The same mathematics once used to calculate gunpowder trajectories now determined irrigation angles for the Shah's tulip gardens. Even more remarkably, the treaty's safe passage clauses allowed teams of Persian and Turkish engineers to collaborate openly for the first time. A surviving notebook from 1653 details joint experiments at the Abbasi caravanserai, where Ottoman well diggers shared reinforced scaffolding techniques while Persian geometers demonstrated how to map underground aquifers using weighted plumb lines. Yet beneath this golden age of cooperation flowed darker currents. The same water systems that beautified Isfahan also served as instruments of control. Shah Abbas II secretly ordered surplus tunnelers to construct listening conduits beneath mosques and bazaars' echo chambers that carried whispers straight to his spies. More disturbingly, the treaty's technology exchanges had an unspoken hierarchy. While Persian artisans mastered Ottoman hydraulics, the Safavids guarded their ceramic pipe glazing techniques jealously, knowing their superior sealants gave military advantage. When Armenian intermediaries tried smuggling these secrets to Istanbul in 1658, they vanished near Lake Van, their bloated bodies later found with fingers stained cobalt blue from broken prototype pipes. The waterworks' crowning achievement became their cruelest irony. The monumental Pul-i Koju Bridge, with its sluice gates designed by former artillery engineers, could transform from peaceful promenade to defensive dam in hours. During the 1662 drought, its mechanisms diverted the last trickles of the Zayandeh River to royal baths while surrounding villages withered. Starving farmers who protested found themselves facing the very siege engines their taxes had funded, now repurposed once more, this time against them. The Treaty of Zuhab had promised peace through shared knowledge, but in the end, water flowed where power directed it, regardless of borders or accords. The prisoner exchange clauses of the Treaty of Zuhab read like acts of mercy: thousands of war captives freed, families reunited, battle-hardened soldiers sent home. But in the shadow of these celebrated returns, a darker trade flourished. Ottoman and Safavid officials began interpreting prisoners with grotesque flexibility, particularly when it came to Circassian women from the Black Sea regions. Court chronicles from Isfahan tell of caravans arriving with carefully worded manifests listing gifted companions for royal service, a euphemism that masked grim realities. These were not soldiers captured in battle, but young women purchased from slave markets in Constantinople and Tbilisi. Their paperwork retroactively altered to classify them as repatriated persons under the treaty's terms. One surviving customs ledger from Erzurum in 1642 records the arrival of 73 such companions, their names struck through and replaced with numbers, their true origins buried beneath layers of bureaucratic ink. The loophole relied on willful blindness. When Safavid envoys questioned why so many prisoners spoke no Persian and bore fresh brand marks from Ottoman slave auctions, they were quietly shown clauses about cultural re-education of displaced persons. Ottoman judges, when pressed, cited centuries-old precedents about spoils of war, stretching back to Timur's conquests. Even the treaty's architects weren't entirely ignorant. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa's private diary contains a 1640 entry lamenting the Circassian matter, but concludes it's a necessary poison to secure Persian cooperation on more pressing issues. The real tragedy unfolded in the details. Many of these women came from Christian Circassian families that had never been subject to either empire, making their classification as prisoners between Muslim states a legal absurdity. Artistic responses to this hypocrisy cut deeper than any protest. In the coffeehouses of Aleppo, shadow puppeteers developed a coded routine where Karagöz the trickster rescues clay figurines from a scribe's ledger, only for the puppets to shatter when touched, a metaphor for how paperwork turned people into fragile abstractions. Persian miniature painters smuggled subtle critiques into royal commissions. One stunning page from Shah Abbas's Roman II personal Shahnameh shows Rostam battling demons, but the battlefield corpses wear 16th century Circassian headdresses instead of mythical armor. Most haunting of all were the laments sung by Armenian Ashu bards along caravan routes, ballads about the numbers that weep at night, their melodies borrowing the same Circassian scales as the slave songs drifting from palace courtyards. These artistic rebellions carried real risks. When the poet Voshi Bafki penned a verse comparing the treaty's prisoner clauses to a sieve that catches stones but lets pearls slip through, he found himself exiled to the Afghan frontier. But the imagery proved indelible. Even today, Circassian folk artists weaving traditional motifs will sometimes work a single upside-down figure into symmetrical patterns, a silent protest against systems that turned lives into ledger entries 4 centuries ago. The Treaty of Zuhab's greatest betrayal wasn't just the bodies it moved, but the lies it forced into the historical record, rewriting human beings as footnotes in a story they never chose to be part of. Hidden beneath the gilded surfaces of Topkapi Palace's miniature paintings lies a silent scandal. The official depiction of the Treaty of Zuhab's signing, commissioned by Sultan Murad Roman IV himself, shows a scene of perfect symmetry. Ottoman and Safavid delegates facing each other across a low table, their hands hovering over the parchment while court scribes stand poised with ink-stained fingers. But tilt the page toward the light, and ghostly outlines emerge beneath the paint, the shadowy forms of 3 figures scrubbed from history. These were no ordinary observers. Infrared scans reveal their original positions flanking the Grand Vizier, their turbans marking them as high-ranking pashas. By the time the ink dried on Zuhab, these men had been strangled with silk cords, their crimes so dire that even their likenesses were deemed too dangerous to preserve. The miniatures artist, Osman the Illustrated, left a clue in his margin notes. The Sultan commanded their faces erased like footsteps in wet sand. Symbolism bleeds through every brushstroke of this carefully curated memory. The cypress trees framing the scene aren't just decorative, they're a visual pun. Ottoman cypresses, straight as spears, intertwine with the gracefully bending Safavid varieties, their branches forming an arch over the negotiators. This wasn't artistic license, it was propaganda. In Persian poetry, cypresses represented eternity, while Ottoman law saw them as symbols of martyrdom. Their fusion in the painting whispered what the treaty dared not say aloud, that these enemies were now bound together in ways neither could escape. Even the carpet under the negotiators' feet tells a story. Its repeating geometric patterns mirror the fortresses along the new border, a subconscious admission that peace was just war by other means. The most telling detail hides in plain sight. Among the stacks of documents beside the treaty sits an open ledger, its pages filled not with text but with tiny ships sailing perfect rows. This was no random flourish. Ottoman naval records prove that within weeks of Zuhab's signing, the empire diverted 32 galleys from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a redeployment that would later crush Venetian ambitions at the Battle of the Dardanelles. The artist had slipped a military secret into his masterpiece, knowing the Sultan's enemies would be too busy studying faces to notice the real threat lay in those inked waves. These visual subterfuges reflect a deeper philosophical shift. Where earlier Ottoman art glorified battlefield heroics, the Zuhab miniatures celebrate something far more radical, the messy, unheroic work of compromise. The negotiators aren't depicted as conquerors but as weary men, their postures slumped, their beards streaked with grey, their inkwells crusted from long nights of haggling. Even the treaty itself is painted with unsettling realism, its edges frayed where eager hands had unrolled and re-rolled it during disputes. This was history stripped of glamour, a silent admission that empires aren't built on valor alone, but on the inglorious arithmetic of give and take. Yet the painting's greatest revelation isn't what it shows, but what it omits. Nowhere in the scene do we see the Kurdish mediators who brokered key compromises, nor the Armenian translators who bridged linguistic divides. Their absence speaks volumes about how power curates its own myths. The treaty may have ended a war between sultans and shahs, but it was midwives of peace like Saru Khan, the Kurdish chieftain turned diplomat who truly reshaped the Mediterranean world. Their erased contributions haunt the margins of history like the ghostly figures beneath the paint, reminding us that the stories we preserve are often just palimpsests, scraped clean and rewritten by the victors. This tension between memory and manipulation extends beyond the canvas. The same year the miniature was completed, Shah Safi ordered all Safavid court histories rewritten to frame Zuhab as a Persian triumph. Ottoman archivists retaliated by producing parallel chronicles where every concession was recast as tactical genius. Two empires that couldn't agree on borders found common ground in one practice, editing the past to control the future. Perhaps that's the treaty's most enduring legacy, not just redrawn frontiers, but the birth of modern diplomatic spin, where truth became the first casualty of peace. The ink on the Treaty of Zuhab had barely dried when its most revolutionary idea began shaking the foundations of political thought, not in the bazaars of Isfahan or the courtyards of Topkapi, but in the libraries of Europe. For the first time in Islamic history, two Muslim empires had formally recognized each other as equals, neither submitting to the other's claim of universal spiritual authority. This quiet diplomatic earthquake shattered the Ottoman Sultan's centuries-old pretense of being the sole rightful caliphs of all Muslims, a doctrine woven into imperial propaganda since Selim the Grim's conquest of Cairo in 1517. The implications rippled far beyond the Zagros Mountains. When Leibniz pored over Jesuit accounts of the treaty in 1680, he seized on this mutual recognition as proof that sovereignty could be divisible, an idea that would later surface in his drafts for European peace plans. What made Zuhab's approach to sovereignty so radical wasn't just its practicality, but its unspoken heresy. By accepting the Safavid Shah as a legitimate ruler rather than a rebellious heretic, the Ottomans inadvertently acknowledged that political authority could exist separately from religious supremacy. Persian court chroniclers reveled in the irony, noting how Ottoman diplomats now referred to Shah Abbas as brother in official correspondence, a term once reserved only for fellow Sunni monarchs. This linguistic shift didn't go unnoticed by European observers. Hugo Grotius, then formulating his groundbreaking theories on international law, cited Zuhab in Marginalia as evidence that even bitter religious rivals could establish secular frameworks for coexistence. The treaty became a silent mentor to the Peace of Westphalia a decade later, where European states would similarly decouple sovereignty from religious unity. The mechanics of this recognition were as ingenious as they were subtle. Zuhab's negotiators avoided theological debates entirely, focusing instead on tangible markers of equality. When Safavid envoys insisted their seals appear alongside Ottoman ones on every page, it wasn't just bureaucratic vanity, it visually reinforced parity. The treaty's ceremonial protocols were equally calculated. Persian ambassadors, once required to kneel when presenting credentials, now stood eye to eye with the Grand Vizier, their gifts of Isfahan steel mirrors deliberately matching the value of Ottoman gold pendants. These staged performances of equality mattered precisely because they were so public, witnessed by merchants and foreign agents who carried word to every capital from Moscow to Madrid. For Enlightenment thinkers, Zuhab offered something rare, a real-world example of Hobbes' Leviathan tamed by mutual interest. Leibniz's 1688 essay on Persian-Ottoman relations argued that the treaty proved self-preservation could override ideological absolutism, a concept that would later underpin his vision of European federation. Even Voltaire, normally dismissive of Islamic polities, conceded in his notebooks that Zuhab demonstrated the art of making peace without pretending to love one another. This grudging respect for pragmatic diplomacy resonated through the 18th century, influencing figures from Montesquieu to Burke as they grappled with balancing sovereignty and coexistence. The treaty's quietest revolution, however, unfolded in the realm of legal precedent. By establishing joint tribunals to adjudicate border disputes with equal numbers of Sunni and Shia judges, Zuhab created an early model for supranational arbitration. Venetian merchants trapped in ownership battles over seized caravans could now appeal to these mixed courts, where Safavid commercial law mingled with Ottoman maritime codes. Surviving case records from Aleppo show astonishing flexibility. One 1650 ruling awarded damages to a Jewish textile trader based on Persian precedents, while citing Ottoman port regulations to calculate interest. This hybrid justice didn't just resolve conflicts, it quietly built a body of cross-border legal principles that would later inspire early international law theorists like Emir de Vattel. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in what Zuhab didn't do. Unlike later European treaties crammed with ideological proclamations, it never pretended to resolve theological differences or erase centuries of hostility. Its genius was in accepting irreducible contradictions, acknowledging two competing visions of Islamic authority, while creating space for both to exist. When modern scholars trace the origins of pluralistic sovereignty, they often begin with Westphalia, but the real blueprint was drafted a century earlier, on a dusty plain where exhausted empires discovered that sometimes the most profound peace begins not with shared truths, but with mutually convenient fictions. Long before European diplomats gathered in Westphalia to redraw their continent's map, the Treaty of Zuhab had already rewritten the rules of sovereignty in ways history nearly forgot. While the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 is celebrated as the birth of modern international order, a dusty Ottoman legal manual from 1641 tells a different story. Buried in Topkapi's archives, Grand Vizier Kemankesh Kara Mustafa's procedural guide for implementing Zuhab outlines principles we now associate with Westphalian norms: fixed borders, territorial integrity, non-interference in domestic affairs, almost a decade before European powers formalized similar concepts. The manual's most striking passage instructs provincial governors to respect Safavid legal judgments within Persian territory, as if rendered by our own courts, a radical departure from the Ottoman Empire's centuries-old claim to universal Islamic authority. This quiet revolution in political thought emerged from necessity, not theory. Unlike Westphalia's abstract debates about statehood, Zuhab's sovereignty clauses were forged in the crucible of real-world headaches: how to stop Kurdish raiders from exploiting border ambiguities, how to split customs revenue from suddenly peaceful trade routes, how to determine which empire's laws applied when a Persian merchant married an Ottoman subject in newly demarcated Baghdad. The solutions they crafted became a masterclass in pragmatic statecraft. One overlooked provision required both empires to extradite criminals to their home territory for trial, effectively recognizing each other's legal systems as equally valid within defined borders, a principle that wouldn't appear in European treaties until the 1800s. The treaty's most prescient innovation was its handling of minority populations, where Westphalia later imposed crude religious divisions, cuius regio, ius religio. Zuhab acknowledged overlapping identities. Sunni Muslims living under Safavid rule could appeal to Ottoman cadis for certain inheritances cases, while Persian pilgrims in Ottoman Iraq fell under a hybrid jurisdiction blending Shia personal law with Ottoman criminal codes. This pluralistic approach, documented in the Mesel-i Yuma Letter 13, Belediyai's marginal notes, created a proto-federal system 4 centuries before the term gained currency. Historians have long overlooked these developments because they unfolded in legal Arabic and Ottoman Turkish rather than Latin or French. While Hugo Grotius was still theorizing about state sovereignty, Ottoman judges in Aleppo were already applying Zuhab's principles to real cases. A 1645 court record details how they resolved a dispute between an Armenian silk merchant and a Persian broker by applying the law of the place of contract rather than imposing uniform Ottoman standards, a landmark moment in conflict of laws jurisprudence. What if Europe had looked east for its model? The counterfactual is tantalizing. Had Westphalia's negotiators studied Zuhab's implementation manuals instead of reaching back to medieval precedents, might they have avoided the rigid territorial absolutism that later fueled nationalist conflicts? The Ottomans and Safavids demonstrated that sovereignty could be both inviolable and flexible, that borders might define jurisdictions without severing human connections. Their greatest lesson, lost for centuries in the archives, was that lasting peace requires not just drawing lines on maps, but weaving threads between them. What if the quills had never met parchment at Zuhab? Picture the Mediterranean world as a powder keg with no release valve, 2 exhausted empires locked in a death spiral of endless war. Without that treaty's fragile truce, the Ottoman treasury might have hemorrhaged its last silver axe on Persian campaigns, leaving nothing for the Western Front. Historian Dr. Layla Tabatabai's analysis of military payroll records reveals a chilling parallel. The funds that fueled the 1645 Crete campaign came directly from eastern border garrisons demobilized after Zuhab. Without those redirected resources, the Ottoman navy could never have broken Venetian control of the Aegean, potentially leaving Christendom dominant in the eastern Mediterranean for generations. The Safavids faced an even grimmer alternate timeline. Already teetering from tribal revolts and economic stagnation, another decade of war might have shattered Persia entirely. Shah Safi's notorious opium addiction, often blamed for his diplomatic disengagement, could have become a dynasty's epitaph rather than a footnote. Dr. Reza Zarghami's climate studies show how 1640's catastrophic drought would have hit a war-ravaged Persia far harder, with military supply chains snapping under the strain. Tribal confederations like the Bakshiris, who reluctantly accepted Zuhab's borders, might have carved the empire into fractious statelets decades before Nadir Shah's rise. Europe's fate hung in the balance too. The Habsburgs, already reeling from the 30 Years' War, benefited enormously from Ottoman distraction. Vienna's 1645 fortification upgrades, the very walls that would later repel the Turks in 1683, were built using Italian engineers who'd otherwise have been fighting Ottoman forces in Dalmatia. Even the global spice trade could have unfolded differently. Portuguese and Dutch merchants, watching the Ottoman Safavid stalemate from the sidelines, used the peace to rebuild networks shattered by war. A prolonged conflict might have strangled the Silk Road revival that later enriched Armenian middlemen and European trading companies alike. The most haunting counterfactual lies in the realm of ideas. Zuhab's cultural exchanges, those unplanned collisions of Persian poetry and Ottoman hydraulics, might never have sparked innovations like Isfahan's water clocks or Smyrna's hybrid coffeehouses. The treaty didn't just pause hostilities, it created breathing room for a cross-pollination of thought that shaped everything from Islamic jurisprudence to early modern science. Without that pause, the Mediterranean might have remained a fractured world of walled gardens rather than the interconnected marketplace of ideas it became. Yet perhaps the deepest lesson lies in the treaty's very fragility. Its success wasn't inevitable. It relied on exhausted soldiers laying down arms, merchants betting on untested trade routes, and hardliners on both sides swallowing bitter compromises. That precariousness mirrors our own world, where the lines between war and peace often hinge on choices made by wearied diplomats in unremarkable rooms. The ghosts of Zuhab whisper a timeless truth. History rarely turns on grand gestures, but on moments when adversaries stare into the abyss and together